And I'm joined now by Dr. MICHA WERNER, Associate Professor in Drought and Flood Management at the IHE Delft Institute for Water Education. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us today on BBC News. And you're based in the Netherlands, a famously low-lying country. So what can the UK and indeed other countries learn from how you manage flood risk there?
Thank you. Good morning. Indeed, as you mentioned, so the Netherlands here, where I am now, is indeed famous for managing floods over the centuries. And as you may know, we about a third of the country is below sea level, and I think managing floods and flood risk has been very high on the agenda in this country. But I think also what's interesting, traditionally we've had a very strong focus here on building flood defenses, such as dikes and trying to keep the water out. But slowly you see that we're changing our paradigm to that. So we're thinking more, how do we actually learn to live with floods? And at times giving space back to rivers. I think that's been a quite famous program in the floods community of sort of providing room for the rivers, which is quite difficult in this country because we're a very densely populated country. So it's balancing where we provide space for the rivers to flood, and but also spaces that we choose to protect, where we try to reduce flooding. And just as in the report, I think very essential to our approach is also this provision of flood forecasting and warning, just in case flood defences do get overtopped, that we can have an adequate response.
So how possible is it to live in a flood risk area? It's really interesting to hear what you were just saying. Time, space, if possible, needs to be given back to rivers to allow them to expand, to extend. So is it possible to live in a flood risk area? Because obviously there's a lot of focus, isn't there, on architecture, on how you build flood houses suitable for floodplains and so forth.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, where I'm sitting, my house is at -2 meters or 2 meters below sea level, but I'm on the first floor, so nothing to worry about. So, in a sense, you would think I'm in a let's say in a flood risk area. But of course, I live in this area because I think that we've managed the floods to an acceptable level, or the flood risk to an acceptable level. And I think that's an important dimension, this question of what is acceptable. So in some places, many communities that we live in are in flood risk areas, could be at risk to different types of flooding, whether from the rivers or even in mountainous areas we see flash floods. So I think it's always a choice of understanding floods, and I think the work or understanding flood risk, the work that the University of Bristol does and is doing is essential to that understanding. But then also a sort of a societal debate of how can we adapt to flooding? Can we live with flooding? As you also mentioned, building houses in a way that we can deal better with flood risk. In the Netherlands, we also have some examples of floating houses in areas where that flood more. So yes, they can live with floods, and you also see across the world areas such as in the Mekong Delta where houses regularly flood, but they're built on poles, so they adapt to that situation. And I think that's a very important aspect of learning to live in this changing climate with climate variability, that increasingly we have to accept that the climate is variable and increasingly will become so. So adapting to that, and not just on the flood side, but also on the drought side. I think that's also interesting here in the Netherlands, that we come to understand that traditionally we're trying to get rid of that water, but now some of the hot, dry summers we're having means that we need to keep hold of that water. So we need to balance sort of the risks on one side of the spectrum with our risks on the other side of the spectrum. So really sort of
Dr. MICHA WERNER, really fast. We are out of time, unfortunately. I could spend much longer talking to you about that, though.
Thank
It's a really fascinating discussion. Dr. MICHA WERNER there at the IHE Delft Institute in the Netherlands.